all other, ethical concerns, including, breaking in, to someone's house and stealing, what could be classified material in order to betray your country. Pretty dramatic.
Yes.
So I think that's completely right. I think there's two other dimensions, though, of his character. One is, that's what I mean, that he's tragic in a certain sense. He's a tragically flawed, example of the masculine. But I think what's important is, and this is something that Warren Farrell pointed out in a book, what was that book's name? The book was called, it was a great book about the myth of male power by Warren Farrell. The Myth of Male Power. He also wrote a book called Why Men Are the Way They Are. And, in both books, Farrell, who was initially, a major guy who worked with the National Organization of Women, makes the simple point that, men do so many things in order to make themselves pleasing to women.
Yeah.
And that's a very powerful point, because we talk about how the cosmetic industry, Naomi Wolf, in her book The Beauty Myth, when she wrote, she was I think 26, talks about how kind of the male domination of women through the cosmetic industry, and there's some deep truth in that, and it's a complex issue. But what people refuse to talk about is how men, a man's like, he's in 11th grade, and he's like into art history, right? He'd love to go become an artist. But he actually knows that if he becomes an artist and he struggles, no woman's going to look at him. So he's forced to actually violate his own inner sense of integrity and to go into engineering, for example, when he has no interest in becoming an engineer and not an accountant, and not a doctor. He would actually like to be a landscape artist. But he just knows that, while men look at the body, women look at the body of the car, and if he doesn't actually make a living, then there's something, impotent in his maleness, and he's violated by that. And then he's forced to actually remake himself into something that he just doesn't want to be, and there's an actual profound feminine coercion there, which is actually just kind of missed because no one's willing to talk about feminine shadow. So I thought that this character, I don't remember his name, Luke, but the manager of the gym character was in that sense a tragic example of actually the emasculated male. That this is a man who clearly does have natural good values. It's clearly a person who does want to be ethical, and yet feels so alone, without his, and devastated by losing this woman who he's in love with, and it's clearly an infatuation. He's not in love with her values, right? He's in love with something that he sees in her, which is, authentically good, but's gotten so distorted, and so he winds up betraying his own sense of self and his own principles in order to be, to be considered a man for her. So that was a really beautiful, beautiful in the sense of artistically beautiful, accurate, perceptive view of something of the tragedy of the Western male.
Yes.
So that's I thought that was kind of a big thing. But now, if we can, to circle, you made, I think, 4 points. I think each one circle back to, and, please cut me off if you think I got something wrong. But so one is there's a system, in the Seattle protest that people are protesting, and you make the point that that's a big deal, that they have some value beyond themselves. And I think that's like a hugely important point. When I was in Israel, I used to get up and at talks say, it's really important to go to demonstrations. It really doesn't matter whether you're right wing or left wing, as long as you're demonstrating. And the point I was trying to make is precisely what you're saying. That is, at least demonstrate. I'll take a demonstrator over a non-demonstrator any time of the day, because what the demonstrator is saying is I'm actually willing to break my routine, take off an evening, and actually, stand up for something. So that's at least a step in the right direction. But here's the however. I think what happened is causes for about 2,000 years, causes were so distorted, causes were so hijacked by organs of power, the church, the state, that the modern Western man, post-Renaissance, post-Enlightenment, right, views himself in rebellion against causes, right? Because causes for 1,700 years were what, the elite and the powerful had the common and simple die for. And so, part of the Western Enlightenment was the individual, autonomous human being, which was by itself an advance in consciousness, as Rabbi Cook points out, right, in one of his letters. It was an advance, it was an evolution of consciousness, that the individual human being has value and dignity and adequacy independent of the structure that he's part of or being asked to die for. That was a big evolution of consciousness. But the shadow of that evolution, of course, became a kind of modern narcissism. A kind of modern, I exist only for myself. Not only am I an autonomous individual being who has value, but I'm actually a self-contained unit. I'm not part of a larger whole. I'm a self-contained unit, and my essential goal is the survival, right, and the pleasure of my self-contained unit. Well, that's a tragedy. And as I actually dissociate from the larger whole instead of differentiating from the larger whole. And this is someplace where I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but a guy, Habermas, maybe the most important, I think, philosopher alive in the last 25 years, Habermas makes this completely off-the-charts brilliant point, which is that, the dignity of modernity, is to differentiate, meaning I'm an individual human being, I'm valuable, I'm differentiated from the larger whole. I'm not just identified with that whole. The tragedy of modernity is when differentiation, sorry for that big word, right, to anyone who's listening, right, becomes dissociation. I disassociate. I'm no longer related to that larger whole. I exist by myself. That's called idolatry. That's what the Torah means when the Torah says, don't worship, yourself. Don't be an idol. And each one of these figures, I didn't think about it that way. I mean, you saw something I didn't quite notice. I think it's completely true. Each one of these figures, other than the CIA guys who are kind of vaguely working for the larger good, each kind of lost in kind of the pathos, of their own story. And there's a kind of sickening feeling as you watch it, and each one is actually a genius, in what Freud called self-deception. So I think in that sense, it was one of the few movies that I actually thought, in a subtle way, conveyed values. That's why I thought it was really a good movie. Of course, it's not obvious in any way, and you can just watch it as a kind of, sick parody. But actually, we're offering, I think, a serious and important, pretty devastating critique, of the modern situation. And in that sense, it really was a values movie, in a deep and real sense, much like, a kind of Woody Allen crime and misdemeanor movie.
Yeah, very, very dark and depressing.
Dark and depressing. Dark and depressing. Dark and depressing for sure. What did you think of the caricature of the woman who was married to the fired CIA agent?
Oh, yeah, she was steel and ice, but I don't think she would. At least she wasn't a fool like her husband, the drunk.
Right. Well,
I mean, she was old, but she wasn't a fool.
No, she wasn't a fool. No, the husband had become a fool, and how did he become that way?
Well, he was a drunk. He was a drunk.
Well, he was a drunk, but I want a holy brother. I want to challenge you on this because I actually, okay, this is when you're about to get mad at me. You ready? Okay, we have to kind of hit this core point here. I actually saw a little bit of him in you. Now, you're not drunk and you're not a fool. so not in that sense, but in a particular sense in which here's a guy who's actually a smart guy. He's perceptive. He's smart, right? But for years, he's seen the corruption of the system. Now, you guys remember in the beginning? I mean, For years, he's seen the system is just corrupt. And no one wants his real report, and it's this petty bureaucracy instead of kind of, remember when he's sitting on his easy chair with his dictaphone, remember dictaphones, he's trying to write his memoirs, and he's talking about the early days when there was a sense of idealism and there was a sense of, values, and he's had one disappointment too many, and he's perceptive, and sometimes, holy brother, I think of you as a person who's very, very perceptive, and who's kind of been disappointed one too many times by the corruption and the clay feet of the world. The question is, what do you do with that? So I mean, I offer that to you, and I'd be really interested in your response. So in that sense, I saw like a real parallel. Does that resonate with you at all? Or you think that's completely off the wall?
I'd have to think about it, but I mean, for me, there are things that I do believe in, which save me from complete cynicism, and so I do believe in a transcendent moral code. I do believe in the power of love and beauty and art to transform one, as illustrated in the movie The Lives of Other People, which